There is perhaps no aspect of filmmaking craft more important than editing. It serves as the building blocks of even the simplest movie, and is the means through which directors create meaning and emotion. It's no coincidence then that the overwhelming majority of the Best Picture Oscar winners have at least been nominated for Best Film Editing, if not winning it outright. Because poor editing is one of the easiest ways to ruin a promising film. It's often said that great editing is invisible, that it lures viewers in without drawing much attention to itself. And while that's certainly true to a point, creative filmmakers have also found ingeniously sly ways to use unexpected and experimental editing techniques to their advantage. Whether or not these tricks were immediately apparent to viewers, in each case they're incredible examples of inventive and motivated editing at its absolute finest. I'm Gareth from Whatculture.com, and here are 9 genius editing decisions that made movie scenes great. Number 9. A single cut perfectly captures human progress. 2001: A Space Odyssey. The match cut is one of the most potentially powerful weapons in a filmmaker's arsenal, cutting from one object to another similar looking one in order to imply a relationship between them. And perhaps the most famous match cut in cinema history goes to the best, or at least the most meaningful, in Stanley Kubrick's sci-fi masterpiece 2001: A Space Odyssey. The mesmerizing opening Dawn of Man sequence concludes with an ape discovering how to use a bone as a tool, which it then throws into the air. At this moment, Kubrick cuts to a similarly shaped satellite orbiting in space in the far future. At once, Kubrick has used a single cut to not only demonstrate the passage of 4 million years, but also human evolution, from the basic adoption of tools to the development of unfathomably complex ones. Masterful work. Number 8. The action scenes were edited in real time on set for continuity. Baby Driver. It's little surprise that Edgar Wright's exceptional action flick Baby Driver was nominated for the Best Film Editing Oscar, given the shockingly precise editing required for Paul Matchliss and Jonathan Amos to sync up the movie's visuals with its pop music soundtrack. But in order to ensure it didn't run into issues during post-production, Wright actually had Matchliss on set for the duration of the shoot, effectively editing the film in real time. To make sure that every single filmed shot met the precise timing requirements of the soundtrack, Matchliss was on set in a mobile editing cart, splicing shots together as they were completed and giving Wright the thumbs up before they moved on. Though surely more time consuming during shooting, it eliminated the possibility of frustrating coverage oversights, which would otherwise only be discovered after principal photography wrapped. Number 7. The shower scene uses quick cuts to imply brutal violence. Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho features one of the most ingeniously edited sequences in the history of cinema. The iconic scene in which apparent protagonist Marion Crane is stabbed to death in the shower. The stabbing itself lasts less than a minute, yet is composed of 78 camera setups and 52 cuts, in turn taking Hitchcock an entire week to film. Even with the film's taboo-shattering depictions of sex and violence, Hitch was forced to use clever state-of-the-art editing techniques in order to imply more than he was actually able to show. For starters, the fleeting glimpses of Marion's bare body are quick enough for audiences to think they might have seen some full frontal nudity, when in actual fact that's hardly the case at all. But the true masterstroke of Hitch's work with editor George Tomasini is how abrupt cuts are used to suggest violence which isn't actually visible in the single, disconnected shots themselves. The scene features relatively minimal blood and no actual footage of open wounds created by the stabbing. But because of the intense and chaotic ending, full of intrusive close-ups and glimpses of a knife driving downwards, we feel as though we've witnessed something truly vile. Number 6. A lower frame rate gives the action sequences a unique style. Mad Max Fury Road. Though Mad Max Fury Road largely received rave reviews from audiences and critics alike upon release, some viewers noted that parts of the movie felt jerky, as though they had been sped up or subtly tinkered with in post-production. This was the result of an entirely intentional editing trick instigated by director George Miller, who deliberately ran certain shots and sequences at lower frame rates in order to give them an unnaturally speedy, undercranked look. This is perhaps most notable during the movie's pre-title sequence, where Max is chased and captured by the War Boys. His movements are fast enough to look almost comically cartoonish at times, ensuring Fury Road boasts an extremely distinctive action movie aesthetic. But as explained by the movie's cinematographer John Seal, there was a more practical motivation behind Miller's artistic choice. He said, "Something like 50 or 60% of the film is not running at 24 frames a second, which is the traditional frame rate. It'll be running below 24 frames because George, if he couldn't understand what was happening in the shot, he slowed it down until you could. Or if it was too well understood, he'd shorten it, or he'd speed it up back towards 24. His manipulation of every shot in that movie is intense." For her exemplary work on the film, editor Margaret Sixel, also Miller's wife, deservedly won the Academy Award for Best Film Editing. Number 5, The Final Duel was filmed and edited to a pre-recorded score. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The climactic three-way duel between Blondie, Angel Eyes, and Tuco in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is one of the most iconic scenes in movie history, and for damn good reason. It's a dizzying, prolonged spectacle in which the three men stare one another down for almost 5 minutes, before Blondie shoots and kills Angel Eyes, with the entire sequence set to Ennio Morricone's gloriously epic musical score. And while it's still typical for a movie's music to be composed in post-production, Sergio Leone took the unconventional approach of having Morricone record the score first, allowing him to play it on set and help him plan the composition of pivotal scenes. Given how beautifully the duel is cut to Morricone's track, The Trio, it was certainly a smart decision to have that presence on set during shooting. Number 4, the horrifying climax turns MTV-style editing against the audience. Requiem for a Dream. Darren Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream is a deeply confronting film about the perils of addiction, narcotic and otherwise, and one which is bolstered by both its exceptional performances and Jay Rabinowitz's masterful editing job. The movie's visual identity is largely defined by its frantic MTV-style editing, which makes heavy use of fast montages to depict the characters' frenzied mental states after using drugs, lending the film a flashy, sexy vibe for the most part. But in the film's third act, everything comes crashing down for the principal characters. And at this point, it becomes clear that Aronofsky was basically luring audiences in with the self-consciously slick visuals, only to then turn them against viewers in a brutal final sensory assault. The closing montage sequence cuts between Sarah receiving electroconvulsive therapy, Marion taking part in a lurid sex show, Tyrone pulling hard labor in prison, and Harry's junked up arm being amputated. It'd be a horrifying sequence no matter how it was presented, and yet Aronofsky's violent style of montage creates a uniquely nightmarish vision that nevertheless remains consistent with the film's glossy, established aesthetic. Number 3, the nonlinear sex scene highlights the movie's central theme. Don't Look Now. Nicholas Roeg's 1973 horror masterpiece Don't Look Now is iconic for many reasons, not least its highly innovative editing style, with editor Graham Clifford frequently employing nonlinear editing to keep viewers uneasy, while presenting them flashes of the grim eventual fate awaiting protagonist John Baxter. But the movie's shining achievement is an unforgettable mid-film sex scene between John and his wife Laura. While the overwhelming majority of cinematic sex scenes are chronologically straightforward, and honestly rarely do much to stray from the expected, in this case the sex is intercut with footage of the pair getting dressed for dinner, which actually occurs after they've had sex. Though an uncommonly raw sex scene on its own merits, the dreamlike editing style also underpins one of the film's main themes, the fleeting nature of time and our perception of it. This is especially relevant given that, unknown to the audience at the time, John's strange visions throughout the film are actually premonitions of his own death and funeral. Number 2, music subtly conveys the passage of time. Boyhood. Richard Linklater's Boyhood was filmed over the course of 12 years, depicting the real-time growth of a young boy called Mason into an adult. Given that Linklater chose to shoot the entire movie on 35mm film, there's an incredible visual uniformity to the project despite the length of time which passed during production. And so, without using titles to signpost annual progress, Linklater had to get creative during post-production in order to subtly convey the passage of time. This was primarily achieved through the use of period-accurate music, with Oscar-nominated editor Sandra Adair placing pop hits like Coldplay's Yellow, The Hive's Hate to Say I Told You So, and Gnarls Barkley's Crazy into the movie as transition indicators. A lesser filmmaker would have just used year titles or found an old visual identifier for the next segment of the 12-year project. But the use of music was a brilliant way to depict the unstoppable march of time in a way our brains would immediately recognize. Number 1, juxtaposing the baptism with murder confirms Michael's character arc, The Godfather. And finally, we have the unforgettable climax of Francis Ford Coppola's mob masterwork, The Godfather, which sees Oscar-nominated editing team William Reynolds and Peter Zinner intercutting the baptism of Michael Corleone's goddaughter with hitmen assassinating Michael's enemies on his order. Reynolds and Zinner's pin-sharp editing shows Michael professing to renounce Satan, all while his rivals are violently wiped out, in turn cementing the film's central theme of Michael's internal struggle between good and evil. More literally, this is the moment at which Michael becomes both a godfather to a child and the godfather Don Corleone. And by visually intermingling these two aspects of Michael's life, it confirms how inextricably they're also linked in reality. Even today, it remains a starkly powerful example of motivated editing craft, of how the juxtaposition of imagery can infer a multitude of ideas and thematics without needing to speak them aloud. That is how it's done, my friends.